That ends general question time. We now move to First Minister's question time. Question number 1, Jan Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Well, later today I'll be writing to all of the party leaders in this Parliament and Margaret MacDonald, inviting them to round-table discussions as we take forward Scotland's referendum consultation period.
Jan Lamont.
We always welcome a sinner who repents and someone who pays attention to others within the chamber. I'm absolutely delighted with that news, and I believe it's in the interests of the people of Scotland that we set to that task together. This week, the First Minister, of course, unveiled the question he wishes to ask the Scottish people in the forthcoming referendum. Do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? Can he tell the chamber today? Well, we know what you think. Can he tell the chamber today what does he mean by an independent country?
First Minister.
Well, I mean a country which is free to make its own decisions, which stands on its own 2 feet financially, which operates in cooperation with other countries in the world, which is not over major issues of policy subjected to a direction of policy, for example, the current attacks on people with disabilities, which are not supported by the Scottish population. I suppose by independence, I mean the normal status of some 200 nations across this planet.
Jan Lamont.
Of course, on the attacks on the disabled, the problem is these are Tories who are doing that, not because they are English. Now, you have to understand that there's not a choice in this country between the Tories and separation. There is another approach. In his version of independence, however, the First Minister conceded significantly this week that the Bank of England would be the lender of last resort. Will that mean that John Swinney not only brings his budget to this chamber, but he has to go to the Bank of England to ask permission on how much he can borrow, what his fiscal policies will be, and how much he can spend? Now, we know the First Minister told us this week he is an avowed Anglophile. Is he not taking it a bit too far?
First Minister.
Well, can I take these points in turn? Firstly, Joanne Lamont's idea that somehow you can separate the fact that under the current constitution, Scotland, not just sometimes, but much of the time, gets governments we don't vote for, I think is a great mistake. I think the right of self-determination, the right of independence, one of the great advantages of it is that people get the government they vote for, not the government that somebody else votes for. Now, I'm not quite certain that this is Joanne Lamont's best subject, but can I tell you, we're talking about monetary policy. Now, I heard her deputy leader on the radio this morning say that if Scotland has a monetary union and the Bank of England is lender of last resort, then Scotland would lose the ability to set interest rates. Now, I have to have news for the Labour Party that politicians lost the ability to set interest rates on the 6th of May 1997 when Gordon Brown declared the Bank of England independent. And it was that separation between monetary policy, controlled by the MPC and the Bank of England, and fiscal policy, controlled by the Chancellor, that perhaps Joanne Lamont wants to catch up on at the present moment. It would mean that the Scottish Finance Secretary would have the ability to set her own taxes, to govern her own spending. For example, at the present moment, to invest in capital investment to revive the Scottish economy. But I must say I'm delighted with these questions, because these are exactly the nub of the debate which is going to persuade people to vote for independence in the referendum.
Joanne Lamont.
I bow to the expertise of the ex-RBS economist, who of course was so wise and sensible that he wrote to Fred Goodwin to urge him to buy the bank that nearly brought the Royal Bank of Scotland. So perhaps some humility about our ability around the economy might be in order, because the reality is the First Minister is actually telling us that he is content that the key decisions that will impact on people's mortgages, savings and pensions will be made by a foreign bank with no remit to look at Scotland's conditions and circumstances? Does he agree with his own Chief Economic Advisor, Crawford Beveridge, that this is, and I quote, not ideal?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I'm not sure about Fred Goodwin as the strongest suit in the Labour Party. After all, I didn't make Fred Goodwin Sir Fred Goodwin. That was Jack McConnell, nor did I have him as part of my economic advisers. That was Gordon Brown. But I think perhaps answer the second question, perhaps when Jan Lamont has a chance to look at it, then she'll see the answer to her third question. The Chancellor of the Exchequer doesn't set interest rates anymore. That hasn't happened since 1997, when the Bank of England was declared independent. I suppose it's quite interesting that the Labour Party were keener on independence for the Bank of England than they were for the country of Scotland, but we'll leave that to one side. Nor is that uncommon in the world. There are some 67 countries, either in formal or informal monetary unions at the present moment. That doesn't mean they're not independent countries. That just means they're in monetary unions. Now, it's been suggested by some ex-Labour ministers, like Lord Minors, that perhaps that currency arrangement wouldn't be wished by people in England. Now, let's get it right. You can't stop people using a tradable currency, incidentally. That was just a myth by the Chancellor's advisers. But can I give a couple of good reasons why I think any Chancellor of the Exchequer would accept the idea of a currency union between Scotland and England? Firstly, oil and gas. Scotland would get the revenues from our geographical share of oil and gas, but oil and gas also provides a £30,000 billion support to the balance of payments and therefore to a sterling area. Secondly, £24 billion of Scottish international exports, including £4 billion of whisky exports. That's why I believe, given the huge support supplied by Scotland to the sterling area, that any Chancellor of the Exchequer would be biting our hands off to get to such a sensible arrangement.
John Lamont.
This comes to the nub of it. You hope and you believe, but it doesn't necessarily be so. The reality is the people of this country want confidence in their pensions, their mortgages and their future. You see, we know that Alex Salmond thinks he has a prescription to Scotland's ills. It is the same one he's had for the last 40 years. In that time, the world has changed. We've changed. We have the euro, the rise of China, the devolution within Scotland, technological revolution, but in good times or bad, feast or famine, high day or holidays, he always has the same answer, and that is separation. Isn't it the truth that the SNP push for separation isn't about people's savings, isn't about people's mortgages, isn't about people's pensions, it's about the First Minister's blind faith that it will be better because he says so. Why is he prepared to take unnecessary risks with people's mortgage, their savings, their pensions, in the midst of the worst economic global crisis since the 1930s? For no good reasons, because what it will create is political separation, yes, but with less economic control in order to serve the people of this country.
First Minister.
I'm glad that Labour are living up to the boast that they're going to argue a positive case for the union. But can I just come to the nub of who's aware of developments in the modern world? Over the last few decades, the number of independent countries in the United Nations has gone from 50 to 200. I would have thought, if we're talking about the tide of history is moving towards the status of independence. Actually, 50 of these countries since the Second World War have become independent from London. And you know what? Not a single one of these countries has applied to get back under London control. Scotland would emerge as an independent country with the sixth highest wealth per head in the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. That in itself is not the argument for independence. The argument for independence is self-determination. But given we'd be the sixth most prosperous country in the developed world, most people in Scotland will have some degree of confidence in Scotland's ability not just to survive, but prosper as a socially just, economically progressive society.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, I wish the Secretary of State a speedy recovery from his current ailment, and I hope to meet him next week to discuss the details of the Scottish Government's consultation, Your Scotland, Your referendum.
Ruth Davidson.
Yesterday, the First Minister finally brought a little bit of clarity to some parts of the process of the referendum. Today, I hope we can agree we need slightly more clarity than we've just had on a number of substantive principles upon which the people of Scotland will vote. The First Minister repeatedly asserts that he wants independence so that the Scottish Government can have all the economic levers at their disposal. Yet he's just obfuscated answering questions on this issue. He now maintains that he wants to keep the pound. He wants to leave the United Kingdom but remain part of the United Kingdom currency union, which means an independent Scotland will have its interest rate set by the Bank of England. Does he accept that the bank sets interest rates now, considering the whole United Kingdom, but would be unlikely to give Scotland a second thought after independence, leaving Scotland with less control?
First Minister.
If the Bank of England is so concerned for Scottish economic conditions, perhaps the Conservative Party at some point will turn their attention to why I don't think there's a single Scot on the committee of the Monetary Policy Committee. There are two Bank of England employees in the whole of Scotland, as far as I know, at the present moment. And the whole basis on which a monetary union is constructed is, yes, we would have influence in the same way and other monetary unions allow that influence. We have no influence whatsoever at the present moment. But can I bring her back to the nub of the point? When the Labour Party in government, subsequently agreed to by the Conservatives, decided on a policy of an independent monetary authority, they gave away any ability of politicians to control interest rates. It has to be said that across the developed world that has been a continuing trend since that period. So therefore, the idea that politicians in London control interest rates now is totally fallacious. There are many advantages for both Scotland and England of having a currency union, nor is this a new idea. This is something that's been in SNP documents for some considerable time.
Ruth Davidson.
He thinks he's answered one question. I'm not sure it was entirely the one I asked. But let's move on to something else, shall we? The First Minister has been telling media organisations, not even just in this country but elsewhere, that the pound could be a transition currency, just like in Australia when it became independent. So if that's the First Minister's transition plan, what's his ultimate banknote of choice? Is it the euro, much loved by him and the SNP? Or perhaps he's planning his own currency, the Salmond shilling? The First Minister asserts that an independent Scotland would not be forced to join the euro as an accession country when the weight of legal opinion states otherwise. He asserts that the Bank of England would act as a lender of last resort for Scotland, which would then be for us the bank of a foreign nation. On this vital issue, he's all over the place. He twists and turns according to his audience. For almost 40 years, the First Minister has campaigned on independence. But he leaves dangerous uncertainty on the issues that matter. Isn't it the truth that the First Minister has no plans to assume the full levers of financial power because either of the options that are flirted between see significant control by either Europe or London, with even less influence than we have now?
First Minister.
The bit about transition is what Ruth Davidson is in her own mind, but she's perfectly correct to say that Australia was part of the sterling area after it became an independent country. It's also perfectly correct for me to say in the world of 200 nations, 67 of them are either in currency unions or informal currency arrangements. That does not mean that they are not independent currencies. What it means is, in terms of economic policy, they've decided to enter a monetary union or a currency arrangement. Now, I look forward to the Conservative Party touring these 67 countries and telling them they're not really independent because they've decided that it's the best economic policy to have a currency union. The two things are totally fallacious. What independence gives us is control over our fiscal policy. It allows us to set our spending and taxation priorities. For example, we might not wish to pursue the Conservatives' misguided attack on people with disability in Scotland at the present moment. We might decide we want to make the Scottish economy more competitive to attract even more international investment. And above all, we'd have the great advantage of having access to Scotland's natural resources, which for the last 30 years has been denied to us by successive Conservative and Labour governments who've used the cash instead to bankroll successive Tory and Labour Chancellors of the Exchequer. So I think control over taxation, control over spending and control over Scotland's natural resources looks to me like an attractive independent proposition for the people of Scotland.
Fiona MacLeod.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Further to the question from Mark MacDonald last week, I wonder if the First Minister has any updated information for Sang's sister company, Calanique, which is headquartered in Kirkintilloch in my constituency of Strathgelvin and Bearsden.
First Minister.
The Minister for Energy Enterprise and Tourism, Fergus Ewing, spoke with AIB UK plc last Thursday and will meet them next week to discuss the concerns raised about both Sangs and Canalick by Mr MacDonald. He has also discussed the situation with Administrator Zolfo Cooper to ensure every avenue is being explored to keep the businesses operating. In all of this, our chief abiding concern, in common with the constituency members who have expressed concern, is to keep jobs and businesses in these challenging economic times.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Next meeting of the Cabinet will discuss issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
The First Minister published his budget in September. Since then, the UK Government have changed their plans and added extra money to the Scottish Bloc. Since September, when he published his budget, how much extra money has his government received?
First Minister.
Well, the budget original plans were to reduce Scotland's capital direct budget over the next 4 years by 36%. Under the revised plans, that reduction becomes 32%. Now, I know that in successive questions, Willie Rennie has pointed to the 4% and said to the Scottish Government, what are you doing with this great funding boost that you've received? Can I suggest to Willie Rennie, most people will regard a cut from 36% to 32% as better than 36%, but it's still a cut of a third of our capital budget, which we would like to have the power to reverse.
Willie Rennie.
For the second week running, I've asked him a basic question about financial control in his government, and he hasn't known the answer. Absolutely. He doesn't need to look across at Mr Swinney. He's looking into Mr Swinney's eyes for the answer. I can tell him that the Scottish Parliament Financial Scrutiny Unit has provided a note which sets out that he has an extra £400 million more available this year and next. Given that there have been 63,000 emails from college students, and the National Union of Students have told him this week that his college cuts hit, and I quote, the poorest people in some of the poorest communities. I can't understand why he's been so stubborn. We have discussed this before many times. His cut is £40 million. He's got 10 times that available. Will he agree to look again at this, at the budget, and see if he can do the right thing for Scottish colleges?
First Minister.
Well, can I separate the three bits of the question? Willie Rennie now refers to £400 million. The figure comparable of the cut, of which the £400 million is a replacement, is £3 £3,000 million, still leaving a shortfall of £2.6 billion. Secondly, it's best, if you look at both capital injection into colleges, extremely good. I've got here figures, for example, in college student funding support. When we took office, it was £69.6 million. Planned spending in the next 2 years is £84.2 million. That seems to me a very strong result in these difficult economic times. And lastly, Willie Rennie criticises me for having colleagues here to take the key specialist advice that the Finance Secretary offers me on many, many occasions. I'm sure Willie Rennie would love to be in a position where he could look round and get advice from lots of colleagues.
Question number 4, Christine Graham. Can we just settle down, please? Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions statement that the UK Government's proposed benefits reforms will not lead to an increase in child poverty in Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, the Department for Work and Pensions' own assessment of the impact of the proposed upper limit on benefits suggests that 7,000 to 8,000 children in Scotland will be adversely affected by this proposal alone. The most current figures for 2009-10 from the DWP place the number of children in poverty in Scotland at 20%, far, far too high, although it is the lowest level since devolution. However, the number is very, very high, and the Health Secretary is seeking a meeting with Ian Duncan-Smith as soon as possible to seek assurances that, as a result of these proposals, this trend of declining percentages of child poverty is not now going to be put into reverse.
Christine Graham.
Can I thank the First Minister for a very full response? Of course, the Scotland Office Minister, David Mundell, was unable to answer that question when asked on several occasions in an interview earlier this week. Even though it's his government imposing the cuts, does the First Minister agree that if a UK government can't even answer these questions, then the power to make decisions on such an important issue should rest with this Scottish Parliament? In particular, does he agree that child benefit with an uptake of 96% should remain a universal benefit?
First Minister.
Well, there's a few things in that question, and I want to put the... Well, I have here a transcript of the Junior Minister at the Scotland Office being interviewed on the 24th of January in Good Morning Scotland. I'm going to put it in spice on the record so that every member of this Parliament has the opportunity to read the Junior Minister being asked 7 times the question that Christine Graham has just asked me. And I just make the point, if people who are actually proposing a policy are not aware of the impact it has on the number of children who are going to be affected, then that might be a good reason for them not proposing the policy. In terms of Christine Graham's question, then I was looking at the comments of Martin Syme, Chief Executive of the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations, when he gave evidence, and again in the press this very morning, quote, "The United Kingdom Government's welfare reform programme is going to have a dramatic impact on some of the poorest people in Scotland. For many voluntary organisations, cutting welfare at a time of rising demand is simply wrong. But the content and purpose of some of the specific proposals reflects neither the values nor needs of Scotland. We could and should be doing things very differently." I agree with Martin Syme, and I think this Parliament should have the ability to legislate on these matters.
Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland is not making the progress on tackling child poverty that either the First Minister or I would want to see, but I do look forward to the Government's report on their child poverty strategy in March. On the broad issue of anti-poverty strategy, Achieving Our Potential was published in 2008. Since then, we've had recession, budget spending reviews, cuts. A lot has changed between 2008 and 2012. Will the First Minister therefore commit to looking again at the approach, not necessarily a root and branch review, but some consultation and a refresh to ensure that the Tackling Poverty Board and Government's priorities are still right, that policies are still achievable and indeed on track?
First Minister.
Yes, I commit to bringing forward further consultation and papers on these matters, and I hope that Drew Smith will understand when I tell him very seriously that the ability of this government to continue the welcome improvements, not enough, but still welcome improvements we've seen on the percentage of numbers of people with child poverty in Scotland in terms of families across the country is at best severely constrained by the current changes in welfare benefits, and at worst, not just in Scotland but across these islands, is going to be put into reverse. Now, is that not an argument, if Drew Smith accepts that proposition, of why that particular policy direction should be under the control of this Parliament, where the views and expressions of the Scottish people and their feelings on these matters prevail, as opposed to leaving it into the hands of ministers who don't even know the effect of their own policies?
Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has a carer strategy for Scotland with a particular focus on young carers. Can the First Minister reassure me that the detrimental impact of the Welfare Reform Bill will be monitored to ensure that this most vulnerable group of young people in Scotland are properly supported?
First Minister.
Yes, I can. And the impact, I think, of the vast majority of members of this Parliament who united just before Christmas to express concern about the direction of aspects of the welfare reform process, I think requires that we have not just that monitoring but reports and consultations brought to this Parliament so that we have the ability to understand the full effects of what the legislation is at the present moment. I also repeat the argument that it would be a good idea not just to be able to monitor the effects, but to have the ability and power to effectively stop them happening.
Question number 5, Michael McMahon.
Sir, to ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government considers any local authority to be not fit for purpose.
First Minister.
Well, local authorities deliver vital and valued services for the people of Scotland. I recognise the commitment of their employees who are working hard to provide these services in our communities. Yesterday, of course, the Budget Bill passed stage 1 in this chamber, which, despite the United Kingdom funding cuts, confirms that over the 3 years from 2012 to 2015, the spending review period, local government's revenue funding budget is being maintained. Their share of the overall budget will be higher in each year of the settlement than it was in 2007-2008 when this government took office.
Michael McMahon.
I was going to thank the First Minister for his answer, but I don't think it actually reflected the question I asked, so I'll ask him a supplementary, which he might be able to answer. Does the First Minister agree with Alec Neil's view that North Lanarkshire Council is not fit for purpose, that it is overstaffed, that social workers refuse to help people, and that staff badger people on low incomes? Or does he agree with Audit Scotland, who reported that North Lanarkshire Council is a high-performing council with good strategic direction and good leadership with clear vision? Does he agree with the trade unions in North Lanarkshire that Alec Neil's comments do little for the morale of thousands of low-paid, loyal, dedicated and hard-working public servants? And will he therefore ask his Cabinet Secretary to apologise for insulting those employees, and will he offer his own apology to those North Lanarkshire Council staff who are rightly offended by Alec Neil's gratuitous attack upon them?
First Minister.
No, because luckily I read the Herald of the 21st of January and quoting directly, Alec Neil is actually in liaising with some of our friends in the north of England to try and do something about a fast rail project which doesn't seem to be going to get beyond the Midlands of England for the next 20 years from the Westminster government. But what I read from Alec Neil was, quote, "Any sensible person knows my comments were directed at the Labour leadership, not the workers for whom I have the highest regard." Clearly, when he's referring to sensible people, that didn't include Michael McMahon.
Question number 6, John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to promote Scotch whisky.
Ms McMahon, please be quiet. First Minister.
Having secured geographical indication protection for Scotch whisky in China over a year ago, the first international product to receive such legal protection, I personally launched the Scotland Food and Drink Strategy for Asia in China in December. China is an emerging Scotch whisky market with massive growth potential. Direct exports soared to £62.3 million in the 12 months to November 2011. Worldwide, of course, whisky exports reached a record high of £3.54 billion in 2010.
John Finney.
I thank the First Minister for his response and welcome the success of Scotland's thriving whisky industry. Does the First Minister not find it quite frankly pathetic that certain news reports on Sunday claimed Foreign Secretary William Hague was briefing against the use of whisky in embassies when Scotland becomes independent?
First Minister.
Well, I thought second only to pinching the pandas. That was the most ludicrous scare story concocted by UK government ministers, and so far, and there was a lot of competition, all part, presumably, of the Prime Minister's positive case for the Union. I do think that the international whisky industry will survive not being served up at UK embassy receptions. But looking into this, I've discovered some interesting detail. Currently, when Scottish Development International judged one of the most successful international development agencies in the world and recorded Scotland having the best record for international investment by Channel 4 Fact Check, among many other observers, when Scottish Development International holds receptions promoting whisky in our international embassies, we are charged up to £3,000 a time for the privilege. But when UK trade and investment hold receptions, they're charged nothing at all. Now, I've got to confess, and I have to say to this chamber, I am lax in not knowing this at any time over the last 4 years. So I really do think we should remind William Hague of that old ditty from Andy Stewart. How nice it would be if the whisky were free and the embassies full up to the brim.
That ends First Minister's question time. I now suspend until 2:15.